Hello and welcome to another Capital Ideas. Our guest this week is Dick Pryor, who's the news anchor at OETA at Channel 13. Welcome back.
Thank you, Sandy. It's good to be back.
Well, good. Last spring we had you visit with us, and we talked basically in general about the role of OETA in the public broadcasting and news decisions and all those kinds of things in a very general kind of fashion. And this time I thought we might spend our time primarily talking about the election, since this is the fall of the presidential election, and how decisions are made and news reporting along those kinds of lines, and just the mechanics of how it all works in a year like this. We were visiting before we started taping here, and we're talking about the conventions that had just ended, both the Republican and the Democratic. And I know that PBS, which is what you work with on OETA, had some kind of an arrangement with NBC so that they did a partial evening with NBC people and then split off when NBC went commercial at 9 and you stayed on for the public. How did that work?
I think that worked pretty well. People liked that from what I've heard, more so than the commercial stations. That's the major networks, ABC, CBS, NBC, which just devoted an hour each night to the convention. And I really don't know whether you can get a full flavor of the convention from just an hour each night. So I think that's a pretty good partnership between PBS and NBC. I still think that it's not enough coverage, but I think it's better than what the other networks provided.
Why do you feel it's not enough?
Well, you know, we have political conventions only once every 4 years. And I don't think it's asking too much to take 3 or 4 hours out of 4 nights during a week, once every 4 years, to find out what our major political parties are all about, and to find out what our candidates are all about, and where they stand on issues. Now, sure, it's political. It's a political convention. It's a nominating convention. It's probably longer than it needs to be. I think they could do it in 3 nights. First night for speeches, keynote. Second night for nominating and approving the party platform. And the third night for the acceptance speeches. I think that's probably all you would need. But, you know, for the major networks to decide that this is not newsworthy, so we're going to just give you an hour each night, so we can do what? So we can show some more inane situation comedies. You know, I think the American people are smarter than that. They may not watch it because the ratings are not all that good typically for political conventions, but I think it should be there. And not just on cable, not just on C-SPAN or on CNN, but I think that although they're commercial and they have to sell commercials and they don't want to lose money, I think that the major networks should provide more campaign coverage than they do.
I hear you saying that the conventions still serve a purpose, and I'm going to date myself here a little bit. Our first television set in my home arrived right at the time of the Republican National Convention when Dwight Eisenhower was president, and that's where I got my first introduction to television, was watching the Republican National Convention. And I don't think I'll ever forget that image. But the conventions in those days were contentious. There were multiple candidates. There was a real question of who was going to win the nomination, and the vice presidential issue was not cut and dried. Plus, they did a lot more coverage of on the floor, in the back room, talking about the platform machinations, because a lot of that was done there, not prior to. Have the conventions lost their flavor because there's no excitement to them anymore?
I think they've probably lost their flavor for the very reason that you stated, and that is that it's pretty much cut and dried. We don't have contentious conventions anymore where the nominees are decided at the conventions. They're decided much earlier. And because we do it that way now, I don't think the conventions are as important. But I disagree with people like Ted Koppel, for instance, who say, if it's newsworthy, we'll break away and we'll cover it. Well, I would like to think that it's newsworthy even if it's not contentious. I don't think we have to have riots like the 1968 Democratic Convention to make it newsworthy.
Right.
And if it's a well-run convention, if we're hearing from people who have things to talk about, issues to present, I think we should hear that, because I think it's important to generate that dialogue and for people to know what the people in these major political parties are thinking. And another thing that I think is important, and the networks get away from it, is the little video introduction of the candidates. Typically, they will talk over those video presentations. I'm talking about the commercial networks.
Right.
They will have their analysts talk during that time, and we don't see that. I think that's a mistake. Sure, it's slick, it's well scripted, it's put together. You know, it is a campaign commercial. But I think it's also important to find out what the parties want us to know about their candidate. And that might be the one time, 15 minutes, every 4 years, when you really see that in a boiled down, comprehensive version of what this candidate is all about. And so I'd like to see that. I know C-SPAN goes ahead and carries that. I think that's a good idea. I think it's important to know more than just what the analysts think for half an hour and then hear a couple of speeches.
What was your role during all of this? Did you have any particular role? Did they just simply use the feeders off the national?
As far as the convention goes, our role was pretty limited, although during the Democratic convention we had the primary election in Oklahoma. So we had our regular election night coverage, which went from 7 until about 10:30, until the races were decided. And then we did cut away from our coverage to go to the convention. That particular night we heard some of Jesse Jackson's speech. We also heard some of the First Lady's speech. Actually, I think we heard all of her speech that night. So we interspersed our coverage with the convention. After that night, the rest of it was just the political convention, and we didn't really have anything to do with that.
Okay. You've got primary, you were talking about the primary, then you have another runoff coming up next week, and then the regular election. Now you come on and rather than do just your news reporting, which is from 6:30 to 7 every evening, is that right?
Right, 6:30 to 7 on Channel 13.
Okay, on those particular evenings, you're there all evening, right?
On the nights of the elections.
On the nights of the
right.
elections, okay. How much responsibility do you have to get prepared for those, or do they just hand you the information and you run with it?
Well, it's kind of a cooperative effort. We're handed some information. Our news director keeps files, as I do too. Our news director keeps files on the different races, and then she gives us what she has gathered so that we can read up and study. But really, it's more a matter of what we want to do. And I think it's kind of self-defense. You want to know. You want to get out there and you want to present the best presentation that you can. So you want to do the research.
The homework.
And the homework. And and I found that, I think this goes for anything, that you have to do your homework. That's where football games are won. That's where elections are won. That's where you get your grades in school. It's from doing your homework.
Now you started out doing sports, right?
Right.
Okay, and then you were on one of the commercial channels in Oklahoma City, Channel 5?
Channel 5.
Channel 5 before you went to Channel 13. Did you do news at Channel 5?
No.
You didn't do news?
No, and I didn't do news at Channel 2 in Tulsa or Channel 3 in Wichita Falls. Those were the other stops along the way.
Okay, but you were there,
Right.
and how is the commercial television stations handling of things like primaries and election nights and just campaigns in general different from PBS or the educational channels?
Well, if you're talking about the local stations or the networks?
Local.
Okay, the local stations, unfortunately, I don't get to see them.
Oh, okay.
It's hard for me to say because we're on when they're on. But I think generally, because they are commercial stations, they don't stay on the full time. Obviously, they have to break for commercials. They run programming, and sometimes they'll go ahead and run a show, and then they will put, they'll squeeze the show in, and then they'll put the numbers at the bottom of the screen, which is what we are going to do on OETA for the runoff election on September 17th.
You're not going to have an actual evening like you did during the conventions where you will take the precedence of what's happening? No,
we're not, because there are just a few races to cover, and so we're not going to be there all night long for that. We'll just have it at the bottom of the screen. And that's the way the commercial stations do it sometimes. And sure, they do break away, and they do have their own commentators and do what we do. But generally, they don't do it uninterrupted. And I think, that's understandable based on what they have to do.
Yeah, no, we're talking here and assuming that people watched the show last spring and have a basic idea of how this whole process works. But in reality, the show that you do at 6:30 at night uses a lot of footage from the commercial stations. Is that correct?
That's right. We have an agreement with the commercial stations in Tulsa and Oklahoma City, and we can use their stories, and we get to cherry pick the ones that we like best and the ones that we think are of the most interest to our audience. So we get to pick those stories and put them in our newscasts after they've run on the commercial stations. And then in addition to that, we have our own reporters who prepare our stories.
Okay, and I know that you have people, for example, around the Capitol doing interviews and picking up information. Do you get a chance to do interviews very often?
Not very often. Now, we do on-set interviews. And so that occurs from time to time, maybe once or twice a week. We'll have somebody come into the studio and sit on the set with us, and then we'll interview them for 3 or 4 minutes and talk to them about an issue. And I think that's a pretty good idea. I typically now don't go out in the field and do stories, say at the Capitol. We have reporters, 2 reporters at the Capitol. We also have reporters in Tulsa, and there's really no need for me to go over there because they know the people and they're there every day.
Do you pick the people that you interview on set though, or do the news director and those individuals choose and then you just do the interview?
Generally they decide. They decide what they want on any given night and then just let us know. There are times when we'll make suggestions, and certainly we're able to do that, whether it be an interview subject or a news story. Make suggestions as to what we think people might want to hear, or I've heard of this story, why don't you do something on that? So it is a cooperative effort, but as far as the interviews go, the news director, the assistant news director, the producer, they generally make the decisions.
This is not, I guess it is a full-time job in one way, but it's not really a full-time job for you. You have another profession and another job, a day job, so to speak, that you go to Monday through Friday. But you stuck with it, even though you've done commercial and now you're doing something different. Why?
I love it. I really enjoy it. I've been involved in journalism for many years. After leaving Norman High, as a matter of fact, and becoming a freshman at OU, that's when I got involved in it, and I just think it's fascinating. So I love the business. I think it is important probably to have something else you can do. Broadcasting especially is not something that many people do all their lives. You outgrow it, or management changes and you go someplace else, or whatever. But I love it, and I do have a day job. I am an attorney in Norman, have a law practice, and I'll keep my day job because I think that's probably the thing to do.
Pays the bills, right?
Sure it does. Sure it does.
Sports and then just regular, quote-unquote, regular news reporting. How are they similar?
Well, I think they're similar because the actual mechanics of covering the stories are the same. You have to decide on what you want to cover. You go out with your photographer, you interview the people, you look around, you see what the angle is, what the hook is, you write the story, you edit, and so on. So the mechanics of either a sports story or a news story are virtually the same. I think probably the big difference is that sports is just perceived as, the toy department in the newscast. That's the fun stuff, and news tends to be the serious stuff. But I think you have to approach, at least to me, you have to approach any story seriously. It may turn out to be a funny story, but you have to do the same amount of work to put together a humorous story or a light story as you do a more serious, hard-hitting story. In
your experience of sports reporting now, did you ever have a situation where you ended up doing, you could call it human interest if you want to, but I'm thinking more in terms of a social issue kind of story where you found things going on that sort of fell over into the hard news, like drugs and crime and those kinds of things? Well,
that's an interesting question because the sports department tends not to do that. I don't know where that line is, but there's always kind of a line between sports and news. And wherever I've worked, whenever the sports stories start to take on issues, they become news stories. And I've joked with people before, if it's just a run-of-the-mill story at sports, if it starts to become a really good story, the news department wants it.
Yeah.
So there is a point, and I think the sports departments probably should do more issue-oriented stories.
The reason I ask is that I read Sports Illustrated, and every once in a while they'll have one that's a real social issue kind of a story in there, not just straight reporting on the games and things like that. And I wonder if you ever got those kinds of opportunities, or just...
Not that many, because in this state, and with our time limitations, there's just so much you can do. There's so many good teams and good athletes, good stories to do, and when you have 3 or 4 minutes a night, where do you put them? So we really didn't do all that many stories like that. Plus you have scoreboards and so on. And I think a lot of people don't really want to be thinking during a sportscast. They want to see highlights, they want to see scores, they might want to see an interesting human interest feature, but maybe not one that really makes them think.
Yeah, one of those ouchers. They don't
Yeah.
want one of those. Okay, we'll be back in just a moment with two students from Central Mid High School. Our student guests this week are Kelsey Martin Farewell and Justin Canada. And I think, Justin, you get the honor of asking Mr. Pryor the first question.
Okay. What do you think are the advantages and disadvantages of working at a station like OTA as opposed to a commercial station?
I think probably the big advantage that we have is that we don't have commercials. And that sounds maybe kind of trite, but we don't have to look at the ratings book to determine what kinds of stories we want to cover, and I think that's an advantage that we have. Also, we don't have the breaks, so people sit down with our newscast at 6:30 in the evening, Monday through Friday, and they know, for better or for worse, that they're going to see news for pretty much 30 minutes straight without breaks. The commercial stations, because of the constraints that they have to sell the commercial time to stay on the air, will only present about 11 or 12 minutes of news in a 30-minute newscast. We can present over 20, and I think that's a good thing.
How does OETA decide what political shows to cover, and are you part of that decision at all?
I'm really not a part of that decision. As far as the programming, we have people who've been involved in the programming business for a long time who make the decisions about which shows we want to air when we're talking about programs that appear on a nightly or weekly or annual basis. So I'm really not involved in that decision too much. I think the people who do make the decisions try to look at what's available for the cost and what our viewers, people in the state of Oklahoma, all over the state of Oklahoma, might be most interested in seeing. I think diversity is a good idea. I sometimes would like to see a little more diversity because we are PBS, because we don't have to sell commercials, and we might be able to put on a program that a commercial station wouldn't, because they find they can't find anybody that wants to buy commercials in it. On the other hand, we also have a responsibility to the people of Oklahoma who fund us in part through legislative appropriation and also through donations to put programs on that we think they want to see. So those decisions are made with that kind of thinking, but I really don't have that much input into that.
What do you think will be some of the major issues in the final days before election?
Let's take a look at the presidential election. And I think one of the major issues that the Republicans will present, as they have already, is the character and trust issue. Personally, I think that may be a loser, because unless they can really hammer home this character and trust issue and cause a blip in the polls, people are not interested. It doesn't look like people are that interested in character and trust. I think Bob Dole certainly has great character, and a lot of people trust him. I think he has that in his favor, and he's trying to paint President Clinton as somebody who is not trustworthy, who doesn't have the same kind of character. I'm not here to say one way or the other whether that's true or not, but I think the people don't really seem to care that much about that right now. What they do seem to care about is whether the president is doing the job that they want him to do and whether they feel comfortable. And I think this year is going to be different from 2 years ago when we had a major turnover in '94. I think incumbents are going to do a lot better this time around. We saw that here in the state of Oklahoma in the primary election. Very few incumbents lost in the primary, which is not to say they won't lose in the general election, but I think it's more of an incumbents mood this year. So I think the bigger issue is going to be the economy still. I think if people feel comfortable with the economy and that we have a growth economy and they like where it's going, and polls indicate that they do, I think that's a major issue. I think really the wild card in all of this is Saddam Hussein and how Bill Clinton responds to the threat in Iraq in enforcing the no-fly zones. The Republicans already have made an issue out of Bill Clinton's decisiveness, Bill Clinton's lack of consultation of congressional leaders in making his decisions on how to respond to Saddam Hussein's threat, and have also made an issue out of the fact that he has not gone forward and gone before the public and told what his goals are. Now, of course, when we had the opportunity to pursue Saddam Hussein and to virtually wipe out Iraq, the decision was made not to do that. And I think perhaps with good reason at the time. What the goals should be now, I don't know. Some people would like to see us go in and obliterate that country. Whether that's the politically correct thing to do because of the dynamics of that region, I don't know. But I think that's going to become an issue for a while. That may go away, but I think that's going to become an issue in how he responds, he being the president, to that particular situation. That's an issue that I see. Other issues, I'm not sure exactly what's going to be a big issue. I think it may just boil down to whether the people think the president's doing the job, whether they like Bob Dole more. And the president is a great communicator, and I think Bob Dole, against Bill Clinton in the debates, may not look as good. He's very respected by both parties, by people inside the Beltway, but in Washington, D.C. But whether he presents an image in debates and throughout the campaign that forces people from the Bill Clinton column or the Ross Perot column into the Bob Dole column remains to be seen.
Chelsea?
I just wanted to know if OETA was going to cover the primaries on Tuesday.
The runoff primary on September 17th, we will not do our regular extended coverage. What we will do is run crawls across the bottom of the screen with numbers. There aren't that many races that we'll be following, so we decided not to devote a full evening to all of that. We will be covering with our extended, expanded, comprehensive coverage on the 5th of November for the general election. We'll be there as long as it takes that night. And for those of you who haven't seen our coverage, what we do is go on at 7 o'clock in the evening right after the polls close. We have analysts from both parties. We have people who are involved in politics and those who are on the periphery, either as observers or analysts, party chair people. And we will also talk to the candidates out in the field at the watch parties and various places where we find them. So we run up-to-date numbers, interviews, analysis. We do that virtually uninterrupted. And believe me, it is uninterrupted. We have about a minute break at the top of the hour, and that's all the time we have to take a sip of water. And we do that for 3 or 4 hours. So you can stay with us. And I think that's good, because I think if you watch 3 or 4 hours straight, you can really get a feel for what's going on because of the analysis that we have from people who are in the know, who deal with the issues and the people every day, and I like that.
How do you feel about Ross Perot entering the race again as the candidate for the Reform Party, and what specific ideas do you feel he has to offer?
Ross Perot being the candidate of the Reform Party, what a shock. Aren't you surprised that they picked him? I think
they should have decided, actually.
Yeah, it seems unnecessary, doesn't it? I think Ross Perot does bring something to the table, and I think he's astute. I think he's smart. He has some interesting ideas, mostly ideas right now, I think, that are not going to be major issues with the electorate. You know, when he's talking about trade, I don't think people are that interested in that. I think his vice presidential candidate, Pat Choate, who is from the University of Oklahoma, he's a Texan but went to OU. I think he will provide some insight. He's an economist. He's an academic, very intelligent man who's written books and has been involved with Ross Perot for many years. I think he'll add something. I think he'll certainly be more than Admiral Stockdale was as a campaigner and as somebody who can present issues. I don't think the Reform Party, I don't think Ross Perot will be a major factor this year. But I think they will add to the debate, and we might see a little bit of movement one way or the other, depending on whether any of those issues catch fire. And then I think if they do, then the major party candidates may start to court some of those people who support Ross Perot and adopt some of those ideas.
When you cover any elections, do you prepare in any way, or do you just go out there and do like a cold reading and acting?
Well, actually, what we do is all ad lib. We don't script it, except for the beginning of the show. At the beginning of our evening, we script the first 5 minutes. And by script, I just mean we script about 30 seconds of an introduction, and then we do a round robin. You know, by round robin, I mean we'll say, and also tonight we're going to have coverage from Tulsa. Let's go to our Tulsa bureau and Lauren Farr, who will tell us about what he's going to be doing tonight. And then he will talk about what he's going to do. We come back to the studio, we go to our panel of analysts and let them talk a little bit about what they're going to do. So about 5 minutes is scripted, and the rest of it is just ad lib, wing it, just do whatever you think you need to do. And there is a lot of preparation that goes into that. Production people who are involved in the computer system spend a lot of time getting that set up and inputting the numbers. And those of us who are on the air, including the analysts, have to do homework. You have to know what you're talking about. You have to try to learn the candidates, learn some of the issues, little facts to throw in from time to time. You don't want to just sit there and give numbers all the time. You might want to throw in the fact that this particular person is the Natural Law Party and they believe in transcendental meditation as one of the ways to help solve the ills of our society. That's more than just numbers. And I think people like to see that and hear that.
Okay, I think, Justin, we got time for one more.
With the election approaching rapidly, do you think we will see more or less mudslinging? And what is your opinion on negative campaigning?
Well, negative campaigning works. Whether it's going to work this year or not, I'm not sure. I think President Clinton and the Democrats threw down the gauntlet at their convention when they said, it's okay to talk about issues, but let's don't get into personal attacks and attacks on each other's families. I think the Republican Party is going to stress the character issue as it relates to Bill Clinton. And I think that's probably a smart thing to do. Whether that is a winner or not, I don't know. And if it doesn't seem to make any difference to people, then the Republican Party has one decision to make, and that is, do we get dirtier to see if that works? And this goes for the Democratic Party too, but I think it's more relevant this year for the Republican Party because of Bill Clinton. Do we get dirtier, or do we go in a different direction? And how the people respond, I think, dictates whether you see a mudslinging kind of campaign. If it works, people are going to do it. If it doesn't work, if it doesn't matter in the polls and the electorate is turned off by it, then we'll go in a different direction, more issue-oriented. And I really think that's what we ought to be talking about anyway.
On a national level, I think that's true that the gauntlet has been laid down to try and avoid the personal attacks, but do you see that locally here, for example, in District 4, that seems to be ugly already?
It is ugly. It is, and what I think is distressing, and this is something that we have to think about as journalists, you know, where does the governing end and the political statement begin? And I think it has gotten ugly in that congressional race, and what's difficult there is we have a lot of innuendo. It's not just fact, it's innuendo. Well, maybe this happened, and I don't want to be a party to spreading that kind of thing. So we have to be watchful of that.
Okay, I want to thank you very much for being with us this morning. Got a lot of good stuff, and we'll be watching you on November the 5th.
Great.
Okay, and we'll be back
Thanks.
next week with another Capital Ideas.